I'd like to talk today about the removal and relocation, which is U.S. Native American policy. And the three objectives really were termination, assimilation, and taking the land. Before I get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement for the original inhabitants of this land. We're currently located on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations, as well as other nations, including the Kickapoo, Miami, Menominee, Sac and Fox, and Ho-Chunk peoples. The land that is the city of Chicago has always been and remains an important Indigenous place. Honor and thank Indigenous communities past, present, and future. We show some quick facts now about Native people. There's 4 million enrolled Native people, 574 federally recognized tribes, 326 reservations, 56 million acres make up those reservations. 75% of enrolled people, Native people, do not reside on a reservation, and 11% unemployment on the reservations. Quickly, I want to talk about enrolled. Enrolled means that you have to prove that you're Native. You have to have a card from your tribe that says you meet the qualifications for citizenship. Basically, that is blood quantum. So if you don't have that card, regardless of how much Native blood you have, you're not considered Native. You can lose that in as early as 3 generations, and certainly by 4. So if your grandparents, different tribes married, they had you married someone also Native from a different tribe, and your children may not be Native, because although they are Native blood, they have 4 different Native tribes, so they may not be enough for one. Certainly by the 4th generation, if your child had another child with someone outside the tribe or someone within another tribe, by that 4th generation you could be gone. Your status as a Native could be gone. That was originally set up by the U.S. government really to eradicate and remove Native people. It's their termination policy. Because their thought was by the time, as time goes on, through intermarriage and intertribal marriage, the bloodline would be gone, so therefore the United States wouldn't have to adhere to their treaties, adhere to the commitments of the treaties. In 1491, Native people controlled all 2.4 billion acres of what is now the United States. Today, they only control 56 million acres, which is only 2% of the landmass, which is their reservations. It all started, in my mind, the Doctrine of Discovery. Pope Alexander, the papal bull, said that any land that was not inhabited by Christians were available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited. If the pagan inhabitants could be converted, they might be spared. If not, they would be enslaved and killed. So this is a year after colonization started with Columbus south of here. But the precedent was set. The first legal case, Supreme Court case, that used this settled case was Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. This is a land dispute. Johnson bought land from the tribe directly. McIntosh, and McIntosh bought it through the government agent. So the question was, who owned the land? Chief Justice Marshall cited the Doctrine of Discovery. He said that the principle of the discovery gave European nations the absolute right to the New World lands, and Native people a certain right of occupancy. So basically what he was saying is that Native people don't own the land. They just occupy it. They were like renters. So the case was settled for McIntosh, who bought it from the government. And this case started the precedent also that Native people can't buy and sell their land. The government is the only one that can buy and sell reservation land. The next act was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The affected tribes were Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. Often called the 5 civilized tribes, and I'll get to that in a minute. It was a land grant from the United States. In the southeast where these tribes are located, the western expansion was happening. They wanted the lands that the Native people wanted. So the best way to do it was remove them. They wanted assimilation or removal. This was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. Now, the 5 civilized tribes are called that because these 5 tribes really tried to adapt, and they did try to assimilate. They cut their hair, they dressed in European dress, and rather than fight the United States on the battlefield, they tried to fight them through the courts. They found out that that didn't work either, but at least there weren't any deaths in that. So with this act was the Trail of Tears. You see here these 5 tribes in the southeast removed to what they called then Indian territory. Indian territory is now today Oklahoma. This is a brutal march through the winter months. Cherokee Nation lost about 1/3 of their population, and the other tribes suffered greatly too. This is the one you hear most often, the Trail of Tears, but every Native nation has their own Trail of Tears. For my nation, the Dene, we call it the Long Walk. It's the same story. We were on our traditional lands in Arizona. We're taking off those lands and moved to the Long March to New Mexico in the dead of winter again. Once they were there, provisions were not, there weren't many provisions, there wasn't much food. They ended up going back after years, but like I said, every tribal nation has their own Trail of Tears. Another act that came out that was also a land grab was in 1862, the Morel Act. President Lincoln released public domain lands to raise funds for colleges across the country. Now, where do you think those domain lands came from? You're right, they were reservation lands, traditional lands of Native people. So he put those up for sale. 11 million tribal lands were stolen from 250 tribes. This primarily took place in the Midwest and the West. So the states in the East and the Southeast that didn't have public domain lands could buy vouchers. They could buy land vouchers to get in on this. And what they did is they did. Many of the Eastern schools, some Ivy League schools, have endowments from this act. They started their original endowments from this act, and it's still on the books. So money made from these land sales must be used in perpetuity. The only land grant university in Illinois is the University of Illinois. There were about 56 universities that benefited from this, and they're still benefiting from it today. They took the land from Native people. Some of them were broken treaties, some of them they just came in and took it. They put it up for sale, and then they started their endowments. And as I said, some of these universities are still receiving money off of this land today. That same year, the Homestay Act of 1862, this was an even bigger land grab. If you were 21 years old, had not, or were not fighting against the United States at that time, and you were willing to stay on this land for 5 years and improve it, you were granted 160 acres for your homestead. The open public lands for sale. Again, where do you think these public lands came from? Came from native nations. 250 million acres were stolen with this in 1862. 30 states, 40 million homesteaders benefited from this. We all like national parks, but in 1872, the Yellowstone Act came about. National parks were created only after tribal nations were removed forcibly by the U.S. Army or through broken treaties. 85 million acres were stolen from tribal lands that are today used for national parks. President Grant signed this into law as public parks or pleasure ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, except of course for the people that the land was stolen from. Some of this land were treaty lands, and in those treaties they were promised hunting and fishing rights as well as some of the land itself. Those were also broken. You know, in the United States, there's about 400 odd treaties that were written by the United States with native tribes. Every one of them was broken, and they're breaking them even today. So this was a big land grab. This and the next act that I'm going to talk about were the two biggest acts that really devastated lands of Native people. It was the Dawes Act. The objective of the Dawes Act, as noted by the Supreme Court Chief Justice Morrison Waite, simple and clear-cut, to extinguish tribal sovereignty, erase reservation boundaries, force assimilation of Indians into a society at large. The thought was, we're having a hard time getting rid of these people, so let's try to assimilate them. And the way that thought they could assimilate them is if they would break up native lands with non-natives and natives on this land. So the idea was that any male from 16 to 18 would receive 80 acres. Any male in the tribe over 18 would receive 160 acres. Women were included. So after the land was divided up by these males, 16 and up, the open land was up for sale. And Native people don't think of land as their own. They think of it as caretakers of the land. It's not property, they don't own it. So those communal lands were broken up. They were told if they don't accept this Dawes Act and give up this land, the allotments, they would be denied citizenship. Tribal lands, nations lost 60% of their lands on this, and over the next 50 years, 150 million acres were taken. Now, the interesting thing about the citizenship was that they said if they didn't accept this, then they would not be granted citizenship. Well, they did accept it because it was forced upon them, but citizenship for Native people was not until 1924, 37 years after this act, when the United States granted citizenship to Native people. But they left it up to the states to determine when and if they could vote. So the last state to grant citizenship, to grant voting rights to citizens that were Native people was Utah in 1968. And a good story for me, my father fought in World War II, and in his home state of Arizona, he was not able to vote until 1948, 3 years after the war. 3 years after he fought in the war. But that's not unusual with Native people. World War I they were fighting, World War II they were fighting, and every conflict since, at a higher percentage than any other group of people, but yet they weren't allowed to vote. The Hoover Act in 1947 was a commission put together by Truman. He wanted to cut the federal budget, and one of the things he wanted to cut and solve was the Indian problem. The Indian problem to him was we had these commitments, these treaty commitments, which was education, health care. He didn't want to live up to that anymore. And again, it was about assimilation. You can't get rid of them, let's try to assimilate them. They wanted to make the lands taxable and available for development, and that's a key word. It's always about the land. It's always wanting to develop the land. Take the land away even more and develop, which is going on even today. So they wanted to end the BIA, which is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, tribal governments, and reservations. So this was in 47 when Truman put this commission together. In 1953, the House Concurrent Resolution 108, also known as a termination policy, it was to end federal government's treaty commitments. So after all these years of treaties, broken, yes, but treaties that were signed with the U.S. government, they wanted to end them. So, I know what we promised you, but sorry, we're going to end them. They wanted to relocate tribal citizens off reservation lands. 100 tribes lost federal status over this, and 2.5 million acres of reservation land was stolen. So this was in 1953, which is also the start of relocation. The idea was we're going to move Native people off the reservations and put them in an urban environment. And that was called the Relocation Act of 1956. In this act, in the wording of the act, it talks about termination, assimilation, any government support of Indian tribal nations, again, in protection of trust status of sovereign lands, and eliminate reservations to open for private development. Again, it's about developing the land as their own. They wanted to take the land. I mean, they took it through the Homestay Act, they took it through the Yellowstone Act, they took it through the Dawes Act, and now they want to take it through the Relocation Act. So, in the Relocation Act, they chose 5 cities originally: Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, Cleveland, and Seattle. They received a one-way ticket for their reservation to the city. They got some relocation expenses. There were temporary housing available. They were given a per diem for 30 days of $100. They were to receive vocational and clerical training for job placement. Not all did, and not all of them were placed. And there were limited medical expenses. So most of what happened was they would take members from the farthest destination to one of these cities and place them away. Because in the government's mind, it was success if the people stayed there for more than a year. So if you're like a lot of people in Chicago is one of the cities, a lot of people in Chicago came from the Dakotas. The thought was that if rather than putting them in Denver, if we put them in Chicago, they'll stay here longer because it's too far for them to get home. They won't go home. Well, many did, but many stayed. So there was a success related to people staying here for relocation. To really promote this, the BIA put out different films. This is one of the films that they put out about moving to Chicago.
While preparing for employment or training. Others discuss their housing needs and help them find a convenient apartment. When the new arrival makes a preliminary choice, arrangements are made. When the newcomer is comfortably settled, he returns to the Bureau office to consider plans for earning a living. If he takes training before employment, he may, after visiting several of the city's excellent vocational schools, choose one that teaches advanced electronics. He enrolls with Chicago citizens, some of a few months and some of many years, who are training to increase their earning power. For the young man or woman who completes high school, business colleges offer opportunity to train for good jobs in the business world. For many hours each day, and day after day, and week after week, they practice with the most modern equipment until they are able to hold a steady office job almost anywhere in our country. After the newcomer has been in school or on the job for some time, he begins to feel less like a newcomer and moves about like a long-term resident of the city. Buildings that once seemed so tall are not so tall as they were. Women and children who might have been fearful of the L train during their first days in the city now use it with confidence. When a family first settles in a new neighborhood, the man and wife usually grocery shop together on the day the husband receives his paycheck. Most families soon learn to plan their spending so that the wife can make several trips a week, often with a friend from across the hall. After shopping at several stores, she finds one to her liking, one not too different from those in a small town on a reservation, one where her children will be remembered from trip to trip. After a time, the mother becomes expert in buying the most nourishing foods for her family. For those who wish to use their free time to associate with their Indian friends, the American Indian Center is one of the better-known Indian organizations in Chicago. It is organized for and run by the Indian residents of the city, who make up its voting membership. The Indian Center helps Indians of all tribes make a place for themselves in the community. For those who are interested in Indian dancing, there is opportunity to do so. Approximately once a month, Indians and other Chicago citizens gather for family night at the Indian Center. Dancing is one of the activities. At least twice each year, the center holds fundraising programs, often with out-of-town guests in attendance. Those who have the time and skill may be able to join Chicago's well-known American Indian Dance Club. This, then, is the story of Indians in Chicago. There are 6 million people living along this shore of Lake Michigan. Chicago, just as any other city, has become a good place to live through the efforts of its citizens. Today's newcomer can enjoy the city's benefits only if he is willing to give the same hard work that newcomers of many races have given before him.
Well, I mentioned the BI put many films out like this to try and promote it, and what a great adventure and what great opportunities they were in an urban environment. It was a disaster. The relocation was a disaster. There was huge unemployment because really they would be exposed to low-end or low-paying jobs, all clerical, manual type jobs. A lot of discrimination, homesickness, loss of cultural support, and generational trauma. Now, one of the things when I talk about this relocation, and people mention, well, how's that any different than immigrants that come here from another country? There's a few differences. One of them is, at this time, in 1956, only 6% of Native people lived off the reservation. Today, there's 75%. So there was no exposure really outside the reservations for many people. Also, when immigrants come here, they come here by choice. They want to come here. They make that choice. With the relocation plan, it really wasn't a choice. They left their families, they had to come here, and they weren't given much support once they got here. After 30 days, they were pretty much on their own. That's why there was a lot of unemployment. A lot of people went back. The other thing is when immigrants come here, usually they have a support system that's already set up. I mean, you know them by Little Italy and Chinatown and Little Vietnam and other places because their ancestors, their relatives, their friends came here before and set up a community where they could come to and feel comfortable. They didn't have to speak English when they first came. They could speak their own language and learn English. And they got support through people that had been here. That didn't happen with the relocation for Native people. You're talking about bringing in members from different tribes who don't speak the same language. Many probably didn't speak English or very limited English. So even if you were at an event like the American Indian Center, which started in 1953 here in Chicago, chances are you wouldn't, unless they were your same tribal nation, you wouldn't be able to converse with them if you didn't speak very good English and you didn't speak their language. So there were hardships that immigrants don't face that the Native people face. There is quite a few residents here today still that either they came when they were small children or their parents did. And they have stories about how basically they were abandoned once they got here. And that's where the generational trauma comes from. So I talked about termination, assimilation, and the land. The land has always been important for the United States because they want the land, and they're still going on today. And these locations, Bears Ears in Utah, which has been a political battle for the last 3 administrations. President Obama preserved it with the Antiquities Act. President Trump reduced it by millions of acres. And now the present administration, Biden, he's preserved it again. He's trying to expand it. These are sacred lands of 4 tribes in the Utah area. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is mine, my tribal nation, Begay. There are ancestral sites that are also very sacred. And they're drilling in that area. The drilling was down to about 5 miles, and now President Biden has moved back out to 10 miles. So think of it. of the comparison if you were doing drilling within 5 miles of the Acropolis or the Colosseum. People wouldn't be happy about that, and that's why Native people aren't happy about it as well. The Back 40 mine is in Michigan. It's the Menominee tribe. There's a mine that wants to open up there, and it's right at the mouth of Lake Michigan, which could contaminate the water and the water table for the Menominee. Oak Flats in Arizona is the San Carlos Apache. Their misfortune is they're close to Phoenix, so Phoenix, they want that land so they can develop the land. And then again, the Black Hills of South Dakota. Another quick story about the Black Hills. In 1980, the Lakota tribes settled a lawsuit with the United States government over a broken treaty over the Black Hills. The Supreme Court ruled in the Lakota's favor. So they gave them a monetary settlement. The Lakota didn't want the money. They wanted the land. And as of 1980, that land has still not been given back to the Lakota, and the money has not been taken in by the Lakota. So that's sitting in trust somewhere because the Lakota want the land. Land is all important to them. Here's another reason why the land is so important. It's a natural resources money grab. 56 million acres of reservation land today. 20% of U.S. oil and natural gas reserves are underneath there. 30% of the U.S. coal reserves are under these lands, and 50% of the U.S. uranium reserves. An estimated $1.8 trillion in value. And that's why the land is important to the United States, and taking the land and keep reducing reservation sites. So the next slide I'm going to show you is the look of the land in 1776 through the years. And if you look at this second one in 1850, that's only 27 years before the Dawes Act, and only 12 years before the Homestay Act. And then if you look at the 1894, you can see what those two did to native land. They devastated it. And then the 2017 is pretty accurate. So that's what the land means to the United States. And as I said, the policy, the three objectives have always been termination, assimilation, and the land. Now, prior to European contact, it's estimated there's 20 to 25 million Native people on this, what we call the United States. So the termination policy pretty much worked, because today there's only 4 million of us. Assimilation, that's probably worked pretty well too, because as I said, 75% of Native people live off native lands. They live in urban areas. And most of the tribal languages are gone. But the land is the one holdout, although you can see they've taken almost all of it. We only have 2% now. That's the last holdout. That's what Native people are holding on to. So that is all I have for today, and I want you to enjoy Native American Heritage Month for the rest of the month. Thank you. Ashamed.